What would you do if one day, someone knocked on your door and told you the land you owned, the land you paid for, lived on, and cared for, wasn't actually yours? What if they had the paperwork to prove it, and worse, they had the power to make your life hell if you didn't comply? I never thought I'd have to answer that question. But 3 years ago, I found myself in the middle of a battle I never signed up for, against a homeowners association I didn't even belong to. And it all started with a cherry orchard. When I first saw the 5-acre property on the outskirts of Maplewood, a small town tucked away in the Pacific Northwest, it felt like a dream. The house was old, a rundown farmhouse in need of serious repairs, but I didn't care. What sold me, what made my heart race, was the orchard. 96 towering Bing cherry trees stood in perfect rows, some nearly 40 years old, their thick, gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like something out of a storybook. Every spring, they exploded into a breathtaking sea of pink and white blossoms, and in the summer, they bore fruit so dark and sweet they practically melted in your mouth. Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man who had owned the land for decades, had cared for these trees like his own children. He made me promise I'd do the same before I signed the deed. I meant every word when I swore I'd protect them. What I didn't know was that promise would soon throw me into a fight for my land, my home, and my sanity. Because 6 months later, I stepped into my orchard to start my first season of pruning, only to hear the unmistakable sound of tires crunching against gravel. A sleek black Mercedes SUV rolled up my driveway and stopped behind my truck. The woman who stepped out looked like she had just walked off the cover of a high-end lifestyle magazine, perfect blonde bob, designer sunglasses perched on her head, crisp white linen pants that looked too expensive to sit in. She took a single glance at my orchard, then turned to me with a cold, practiced smile. "Excuse me," she called, her voice cutting through the morning air. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I frowned, setting down my pruning shears. "I'm maintaining my orchard," I said, brushing dirt off my hands. "Can I help you with something?" The woman barely glanced at me. Her sharp blue eyes were scanning the trees, her mouth pressed into a tight line. "This isn't your orchard," she said finally, her voice dripping with authority. "This land belongs to Maplewood Estates. I'm Maggie Whitmore, the president of the Homeowners Association." I let out a short laugh, thinking it had to be a joke. "This is my land," I said. "I bought it from Mr. Jenkins last year. I have the deed." Maggie folded her arms, unimpressed. "I suggest you check your paperwork more carefully. When Maplewood Estates was developed, this orchard was designated as a community space. Mr. Jenkins merely maintained it as part of our agreement. As of now, you are trespassing on HOA property, and I'll have to ask you to stop immediately." I stared at her, my pulse ticking up. "That's not possible," I said. "I own this entire 5-acre lot, orchard included. I'm not a member of your HOA." She sighed, shaking her head like she was dealing with a stubborn child. "Whether you acknowledge the HOA or not is irrelevant. The land transfer agreement when Maplewood Estates was built included an easement for this orchard. You're violating community property, and if you continue, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." I felt my stomach tighten, a deep, uneasy weight settling inside me. "You're trespassing," I said firmly. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Maggie's lips curled into a tight smile. "Oh, I'll leave," she said. "But expect a letter from our attorneys soon. And I suggest you reconsider your position before this gets messy." She turned and strode back to her Mercedes, taking a few pictures with her phone before getting inside and speeding down my driveway. I stood there for a long moment, gripping my pruning shears so hard my knuckles turned white. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived from a high-end law firm representing Maplewood Estates. It was even worse than I expected. The HOA was claiming legal ownership of the orchard due to an easement clause they claimed had been attached to the property when Maplewood Estates was developed. They demanded that I cease all activity on the land, and, as if that weren't enough, they included an invoice for $4,500, charging me for the unauthorized maintenance of pruning my own trees. I immediately called Lauren Bishop, my real estate attorney. She went through the letter carefully, then scoffed. "This is nonsense," she said. "I did a full title search when you bought the place. There's no easement on record. Your deed is crystal clear, this is your property, outright. So what do I do?" I asked. "First, I'll send a response demanding they cease their harassment. Second, document everything. If they trespass again, call the sheriff and file a formal complaint." I followed her advice, installing security cameras around the orchard and keeping a record of every interaction with the HOA. For a while, things went quiet. The trees bloomed beautifully in the spring, covering the orchard in pink and white petals, and for a moment, I let myself believe the worst was over. Then, one afternoon in May, my phone buzzed with a security alert. Someone was on my property. I pulled over on the side of the road and opened the live feed. My stomach dropped. Maggie Whitmore stood at the edge of the orchard, arms crossed, directing 3 men in matching uniforms. They carried large baskets, their hands moving quickly as they plucked my cherries, the fruit still green and unripe, from the trees. I slammed my truck into gear and raced home, barely remembering to call the sheriff on the way. By the time I pulled into my driveway, they had already filled several crates. My orchard, my land, my trees, and they were stealing from it like it belonged to them. I jumped out of my truck, my voice sharp with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Maggie turned, completely unfazed. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly. "The HOA board voted to conduct an early harvest. These cherries will be used for our annual community fundraiser. You should be honored." I clenched my fists. "You're trespassing. You're stealing my fruit. Get off my property. Now." Maggie let out a dramatic sigh. "Ethan, I've tried to be reasonable. But your hostility leaves me no choice." She nodded to one of her workers, who pulled out his phone and made a call. "You might want to step back," she said. "The sheriff is on the way." I let out a bitter laugh. "Good. Maybe he'll finally arrest you for trespassing." She just smiled. "Oh, I doubt that." 15 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up. I recognized one of them, Deputy Mark Simmons, who had responded to a minor vandalism complaint on my property a few months ago. "What's going on here?" Simmons asked, stepping between me and Maggie. "These people are trespassing on my land and stealing my crops," I said, motioning toward the men still plucking cherries. "I want them removed immediately." Maggie produced a folder from her designer handbag and handed it to Simmons. "Deputy, this orchard is community property under the jurisdiction of Maplewood Estates. Mr. Carter has been warned multiple times about interfering with HOA property." Simmons flipped through the pages, frowning. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "Deputy, I have my deed inside. I'll show you the proof that this is my land." Simmons hesitated, then nodded. "Go get it." I rushed inside, yanking open my filing cabinet and pulling out the title documents. When I returned, Maggie was showing something on her phone to the second deputy. "Here," I said, handing Simmons my deed. "This proves I own all 5 acres, including this orchard." Simmons compared the documents, his brows furrowing. "There's a discrepancy," he said finally. "The HOA's documents mention an easement, but your deed doesn't reference it." "Because it doesn't exist," I said through gritted teeth. "My lawyer did a full title search." "Maggie's lying." Maggie gasped, placing a hand over her chest. "I would never," she said, her voice thick with manufactured outrage. "We believe Mr. Carter may have deliberately removed the easement information when he filed his deed. I stared at her in disbelief. That's insane. Simmons exhaled slowly. Look, this is a civil matter. Until this is legally resolved, I need both parties to stand down. That means no harvesting, no pruning, and no interfering with the trees. Maggie's pleasant mask cracked slightly. That's ridiculous. Our community event is next week. We can't just. That's my decision, Simmons said firmly. Maggie turned to me, her eyes cold. This isn't over, Mr. Carter. Not by a long shot. I knew she meant it. But I had no idea just how far she was willing to go. 2 days passed in uneasy silence. The HOA had backed off, for now. I spent my evenings watching the cherry blossoms shift into tiny green fruit, my orchard still standing, untouched, but a knot of anxiety sat deep in my chest. Maggie Whitmore wasn't done with me. I knew it. And I was right. I woke up before sunrise to the distant hum of engines. The kind of low, mechanical rumble that set off every instinct in my body. It wasn't the sound of a passing truck or an early morning delivery. No, this was different. This was close. I jumped out of bed, threw on my boots, and rushed to the window. My stomach dropped. My driveway was clogged with vehicles. 3 sheriff's cruisers, 2 massive commercial trucks with attached flatbed trailers, and, of course, Maggie's sleek black Mercedes parked right in the center of it all like a queen overseeing her kingdom. But it wasn't just cars. There were workers, at least a dozen of them, unloading massive machinery, tree spades, hydraulic lifts, chainsaws. My blood went cold. I stormed outside just as 2 deputies approached my porch. One I recognized, Deputy Simmons. The other was an unfamiliar officer, older, with graying hair and a no-nonsense stance. He held a document in his hands. "Ethan Carter?" he asked. "What the hell is going on?" I snapped. "Why are there work crews in my orchard?" The deputy flipped through the document. "I'm serving you with a court order authorizing the immediate removal of all 96 cherry trees from this property." My ears started ringing. "Excuse me?" He held the papers out. "Due to evidence of ongoing damage and theft, the court has determined that the trees must be relocated to a preservation facility until legal ownership is settled." I yanked the document from his hands and skimmed it, my heart hammering in my chest. The words blurred together, but I saw exactly what I feared. Who the hell approved this? I demanded. The request was submitted by the Maplewood Estates HOA and granted by Judge Weston. I felt my stomach drop. I knew that name. Judge Weston was a longtime friend of Maggie's husband, a man who had ruled in favor of Maplewood Estates in nearly every case brought against them. I spun toward Maggie, who was standing near the work crews, arms crossed, looking insufferably smug. "You can't do this," I said. "Mature cherry trees can't survive relocation like this. You're going to kill them." She gave me a look of exaggerated sympathy. "Our arborists assure us they'll be fine with proper care. Of course, the process is expensive, nearly $85,000 for the relocation. The court has ordered you to cover the costs, considering the damage you've done." I let out a bitter laugh. "You mean the pruning I did under the guidance of an actual arborist? That damage?" She waved a hand dismissively. "You can fight this in court. But right now, these trees are being moved." I turned to Deputy Simmons. "This is my land. My property. You're telling me you're just going to let them rip up my orchard?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I suggest you take this up with your lawyer. But if you interfere with this order, you'll be in violation of a direct court ruling." I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. I wasn't going to let this happen. Before anyone could react, I sprinted past the deputies and straight toward the nearest machine, a massive tree spade positioned around one of my smaller cherry trees. I threw myself against the metal arm, pounding on the operator's cab. "Stop! Get out of the truck!" The worker inside looked startled but didn't shut off the machine. Instead, he looked toward Maggie. "Deputies," she said coolly, "please handle this." Rough hands grabbed my arms, yanking me backward. I struggled, but the next thing I knew, my hands were wrenched behind my back, cold metal snapping over my wrists. "Ethan Carter," the older deputy said, voice flat. "You're under arrest for obstructing a court order and assaulting an officer." "What?" I struggled against the cuffs. "I didn't assault anyone." "You shoved Deputy Simmons when you ran past him," the deputy said. "That qualifies as assault." "This is insane," I shouted, my voice raw with frustration. From the sidelines, Maggie smirked. "It's a shame, really," she said. "You could have worked with us on this. Now, I suppose the courts will have to decide your fate." Before I could respond, they shoved me into the back of the patrol car. From the window, I watched as the machinery lurched into action, the metal spade beginning to slice through the roots of the first tree. My trees. My land. And I could do nothing. But Maggie didn't know one thing. Lauren Bishop was about to tear this entire operation apart. The hours I spent in that holding cell were some of the longest of my life. My orchard, my land, ripped away while I sat helplessly in a cold metal chair, staring at the peeling gray walls of the county jail. My hands ached from the cuffs, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. How many trees had they taken? How much damage had they done? Would there even be an orchard left when I got out? Then, just as exhaustion threatened to overtake me, the guard opened the door. "You made bail." I shot to my feet, nearly tripping over myself as I stepped out into the hallway. Lauren was waiting for me just outside, her face tight with fury. "This was illegal," she said, thrusting a thick stack of papers into my hands. "The court order was forged. Judge Weston never signed off on anything." I blinked, my brain struggling to process. "What?" She nodded grimly. "I called Judge Patterson, the real on-duty judge this week. He confirmed that no such order was ever approved. Maggie and her cronies faked the entire thing." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. "Then we can stop them." "Already done," Lauren said. "The sheriff's department confirmed the order was fraudulent. A county investigator is questioning Maggie and her entire board right now. They'll be facing felony charges for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy." A surge of vindication roared through me, but it was quickly drowned by the urgency in my gut. "The orchard." Lauren placed a hand on my shoulder. "They only managed to remove 2 trees before the work crew got the order to stop. They're being held in evidence while we fight to have them replanted. The rest are still standing." Relief hit me like a truck. "Then it's not over." "No," Lauren agreed. "But Maggie is getting desperate. I don't think she's done yet." And she was right. 2 nights later, I woke up to the acrid scent of smoke. I shot up in bed, my brain sluggish from sleep but my instincts roaring to life. I scrambled to the window, and what I saw sent ice through my veins. Fire. Flames flickered through the orchard, licking up the trunks of my cherry trees, smoke curling into the sky like fingers reaching for my home. I ran. Barefoot, in nothing but sweatpants, I tore down the stairs and out the door, the heat hitting my face like a slap. I grabbed the garden hose, uselessly spraying water at the growing inferno, my heart hammering. I needed help. I sprinted back inside, grabbing my phone, my fingers barely able to dial through my panic. 911, what's your emergency? My orchard is on fire. I gasped. I need the fire department now. The operator's voice remained calm, steady. Help is on the way. Are you in a safe location? Safe? No. Not while my land was burning. I grabbed my keys and jumped into my truck, headlights slicing through the smoke as I tore down my driveway, scanning the tree line for any sign of who had done this. Then, through the haze, I saw him. A dark figure, sprinting toward a waiting car. A man. Stocky build. Familiar. He yanked open the door, sliding into the driver's seat just as I caught a glimpse of his face in the glow of the fire. Maggie's husband. I slammed on the horn, but the car peeled out, tires screeching against the pavement as it disappeared into the night. I was shaking with rage when the fire department arrived, red and blue lights flashing in the swirling smoke. Firefighters poured out of their trucks, dragging hoses, dousing the flames before they could spread further. But it was too late. The damage had been done. By the time the fire was out, I counted 12 trees lost. Charred skeletons that had stood for decades, now reduced to nothing but ash. Lauren arrived minutes later, along with Detective Greg Lawson. His expression was grim as he walked up, surveying the damage. "You're sure it was him?" Lawson asked after I gave my statement. 100%, I said, my hands still trembling. It was Maggie's husband. Lauren let out a slow breath. That's arson. Felony arson. And with the ongoing fraud case, that's enough to put them away for a long time. Lawson nodded. I'll get a warrant. Less than 12 hours later, Maggie Whitmore and her husband were in handcuffs. And this time, there was no escape. The courtroom was packed when the verdict was read. After weeks of testimonies, mountains of evidence, and hours of deliberation, the jury finally delivered the blow that would dismantle Maplewood Estates forever. Maggie Whitmore and her husband were convicted of multiple felonies, forgery, conspiracy, fraud, and arson, each charge stacking against them like bricks sealing their fate. 2 of her board members, who had been complicit in the land grab, were also found guilty. The HOA itself was held liable for damages, the jury awarding me a staggering $6.2 million, $3.2 million in damages and another $3 million in punitive fines. It wasn't just about compensation. It was about sending a message. But the money wasn't even the best part. The HOA's insurance company, realizing they weren't about to cover a massive fraud scandal, pulled out. With no way to pay the settlement, Maplewood Estates was forced to liquidate. Their precious community fund, drained. Their assets, sold off. And the final nail in the coffin? Each homeowner in the HOA was slapped with a $112,000 assessment fee to cover what remained. Property values tanked. Residents fled, desperate to escape the financial ruin Maggie had dragged them into. As for Maggie, her mansion, the symbol of her status and control, was foreclosed. Her husband divorced her in disgrace, blaming her for the empire they lost. She would spend the next 10 years behind bars, with nothing left but memories of the power she once held. But I wasn't done. I used part of my settlement to expand the orchard, planting new trees to replace the ones lost to fire. I created a legal defense fund for homeowners fighting HOA harassment, ensuring no one else would have to go through what I did. Every spring, when the cherry blossoms bloom, I remember the fight. The sleepless nights, the arrests, the fire. And I know I made the right choice standing my ground. Somewhere across town, in a tiny rented apartment, I imagine Maggie watching the news about my orchard's expansion, realizing she lost everything while I grew stronger. So, what would you do if an HOA tried to take your land? Would you fight back, or let them win? Share your thoughts below. Let's see who's faced the worst HOA nightmare.